Although they could be overshadowed by larger starships, attack fighters were some of the most valuable ships in many of the Star Trek universe's fleets. These small, agile, and well-armed craft could function as scouts or patrol ships when operating alone, but in larger groups they could play decisive roles in fleet battles, forming nimble attack wings that could destroy targets larger vessels were struggling with. Of all the factions in the Star Trek universe, none appreciate the power of an attack fighter more than the Dominion, whose iconic Jem'Hadar Fighters made up a large portion of their fleet. The Jem'Hadar Fighter was a versatile and extremely effective warship, one of the deadliest weapons in the Dominion's arsenal, and it embodied the ruthless battle doctrine of the Jem'Hadar and their masters. Welcome to Trek Central, I'm your host, Captain Jack. Before we do warp into this video, if you want to keep up to date on the latest Star Trek news, lore, and more, then make sure to hit that subscribe button to never miss a video from the team here at Trek Central. You can also follow us on social media for daily updates on the Star Trek universe. You can find all these links below, and while you're there, consider checking out Trek Central's Patreon and supporting us on there to help make these videos. Also, while you're watching, what would you name a Jem'Hadar Bug Ship if you were commanding one? Comment below. Okay, engage. The Jem'Hadar Fighter was designed with the shipwrights of the Dominion, the greatest empire of the Gamma Quadrant, sometime before the 2370s. Next to nothing about their production and development history is known, but they were named for and primarily operated by the Jem'Hadar, the Dominion's warrior species. The Jem'Hadar were a purpose-bred soldier race, tough and devoted, and they lived their entire lives in service to the Dominion's founders. Their battle tactics were highly aggressive and sometimes even suicidal, often relying on overwhelming force. In space, the forces of the Dominion operate according to similar doctrines, and the Jem'Hadar Fighter was designed in accordance with this mentality. Much like the Jem'Hadar themselves, Jem'Hadar Fighters weren't built for survivability. They were designed for sheer aggressive firepower, and they were meant to be deployed in large numbers. In battle, Dominion fleets would unleash swarms of Jem'Hadar Fighters, overwhelming the enemy and softening them up for larger vessels to finish up. While the Dominion did have larger cruisers in its fleet, the Jem'Hadar Fighter was by far its most common attack ship, and these nimble craft made up the bulk of the Dominion armada. As you'd expect from an attack fighter, the Jem'Hadar Fighter was quite small, relatively speaking. According to the Deep Space Nine technical manual, it measured just 68.32 meters in length, with a beam of 70.02 meters and a height of 18.32 meters, and it also had a mass of 2,450 metric tons. The ship had a scarab-like design, divided into distinct abdomen and thorax sections. The abdomen was located at the aft end of the ship and divided into two subsections, an upper section which resembled a pair of folded wings with a trench between them, and a lower section which was smaller and teardrop shaped. The thorax consisted of a blocky head at the front of the fighter and a pair of thin wings splayed out on the side which carried the fighter's warp nacelles. The Jem'Hadar Fighter possessed deflector shields, like most starships. These shields were known to be the weakest at the ship's dorsal field junction. While the shields of a Jem'Hadar Fighter could only take a few hits from a larger ship before collapsing, leaving the fighter easy to destroy, they did have the added benefit of insulating their craft from tractor beam locks. As of the 2370s, the technology that made this possible was unknown to the Federation. On top of these advanced shield systems, the Jem'Hadar Fighter had transporter systems capable of piercing the shields of enemy vessels, allowing the Jem'Hadar to deploy boarders to enemy ships without having to wear down their shields first. The sensors aboard the Jem'Hadar Fighters were also capable of picking up cloaked starships, thanks to the use of anti-proton beams and long-range tachyon scanners. Jem'Hadar Fighters were propelled by a single aft-based impulse system, as well as an array of ion-based maneuvering jets. The fighter had a high thrust-to-mass ratio, making it faster at impulse than most larger vessels, and it was also exceptionally maneuverable, able to fly in circles around most cruisers. Only Federation runabouts could outfly a Jem'Hadar Fighter, and they came with far less firepower. The tips of the Jem'Hadar Fighter's wings featured a pair of small, blade-like warp nacelles, which were tipped with buzzard collectors and had a distinctive lavender glow. The fighter's warp systems was powered by a matter-antimatter reactor and allowed the ship to reach a top warp speed of warp 9.6. Jem'Hadar Fighters were capable of atmospheric flight as well as space flight, although they couldn't fight in planetary atmospheres, and they were capable of landing on planetary surfaces. Grounded Jem'Hadar Fighters were boarded via a large access hatch at the far aft of the ship, providing access to the ship's interior. Speaking of the interior, this was incredibly sparse and compact. Jem'Hadar Fighters had no cargo bays and no infirmary, and what rooms they did have lacked food replicators, chairs, or even bunks for the crew, as the Jem'Hadar didn't need to sleep. The only creature comforts the crew of the Jem'Hadar Fighter had were life support systems and artificial gravity. As on most starships, the most important room aboard the Jem'Hadar Fighter was the bridge. This was located at the aft end of the ship's thorax. The bridge of the Jem'Hadar ships bore very little resemblance to those of Starfleet vessels, or even most alien ships. It had no view screen or captain's chair, and while crew stations ringed the ship's walls, they all faced inwards, towards a central dais where the ship's commanding officers stood. In place of a view screen, the ship's commanding officer and executive officer wore virtual sensor displays, headsets that beamed images of the space around the fighter directly into their brains, allowing them to see outside of the ship. Those unfamiliar with the technology found this effect uncomfortable and even headache-inducing. These control headsets could also be used to directly access the fighter's comm systems, allowing the ship's commanders to relay orders to the crew. Jem'Hadar fighters typically carried a total of 42 Jem'Hadar and a single Vorta, a mix of the ship's flight crew and embarked troops. In theory, a skeleton crew of 12 was all that was needed to fully operate a Jem'Hadar fighter. Each Jem'Hadar's first, the highest ranking of all the Jem'Hadar aboard the ship, served as the vessel's first officer, while the sole Vorta field supervisor aboard the ship served as the fighter's captain. The Vorta supervisor and the Jem'Hadar first were both typically stationed on the bridge, where they made use of the ship's control headsets. With such a small craft, Jem'Hadar fighters were actually pretty heavily armed, ordinarily boasting 3-phase Polaron beam emitters and torpedo launchers. The fighter's beam weapons were its primary offensive option. The main beam emitter was located at the bow of the ship, while an aft emitter was mounted just above the ship's boarding ramp. When the Federation first encountered the Jem'Hadar, the phased Polaron beams these weapons fired could penetrate most shields, giving Jem'Hadar fighters a significant tactical advantage over most Alpha Quadrant ships. A handful of Jem'Hadar fighters could easily destroy even the largest and most powerful Starfleet vessels, as the destruction of the Galaxy-class USS Odyssey showed. However, the Federation would upgrade its shield technology shortly before the start of the Dominion War to eliminate this weakness, reducing the Dominion's phased Polaron beams to being similarly effective to ordinary phasers or disruptors. In fact, some Jem'Hadar fighters built in the Alpha Quadrant during the Dominion War were armed with disruptors alongside or instead of their standard Polaron beam weapons. It's unknown whether this was because disruptors were more effective against Starfleet's upgraded shields, or simply because disruptors were easier to manufacture in the Alpha Quadrant, far from the Dominion's main shipyards in the Gamma Quadrant. In addition, Jem'Hadar fighters were armed with torpedo launchers, which fired torpedoes manufactured by a Gamma Quadrant species. During the Dominion War, Jem'Hadar fighters in the Alpha Quadrant were upgraded with green energy disruptors, which could completely drain target ships of power with a single hit. For a time, this weapon posed an enormous threat to the Federation and its allies, and it would have allowed the small wings of Jem'Hadar fighters to wipe out entire enemy fleets. Fortunately, the Cardassian Liberation Front was able to steal an upgraded Jem'Hadar fighter from a dry dock while the weapon was still being rolled out, allowing the Allies to reverse engineer the technology and develop countermeasures. Jem'Hadar fighters typically operated in groups, although individual fighters were occasionally seen as scouts. For smaller operations, such as patrols or attacks on easy targets, they were usually dispatched in squadrons of 3, while the Dominion usually deployed much larger target wings in larger battles. In most cases, the way the fighters operate was the same. They would pepper enemy targets with fire, usually from multiple angles, overwhelming their defenses in a relentless assault. The sheer number in which the Dominion could deploy Jem'Hadar fighters meant that these tactics were often successful. Regardless of the mission, Jem'Hadar fighters were almost always on the offensive, even against overwhelming enemy forces. They operated without regard for their own survival, and Dominion commanders wouldn't hesitate to dispatch Jem'Hadar fighters on suicide missions in order to soften up enemy forces or fulfill some other objective. Even when not directly ordered to, the crews of Jem'Hadar fighters would often carry out suicide rammings, which allowed them to easily destroy much larger ships than their weapons alone could handle. In the first Battle of Chantoka, such tactics allowed the Jem'Hadar to rapidly wipe out a squadron of 15 Klingon starships, improving the Dominion's odds in the battle. Sometimes, Jem'Hadar fighters would conduct suicide attacks without any real tactical need to, just to show their devotion to the Founders. The Dominion is believed to have started using Jem'Hadar fighters sometime in the 24th century. They deployed them in countless campaigns against people across the Gamma Quadrant, using them to conquer worlds and subjugate those who resisted the will of the Founders. The Federation was only introduced to them in 2370. However, when a squadron of 3 Jem'Hadar fighters attacked the USS Odyssey and its 2 runabout escorts, the 3 fighters easily overpowered the Odyssey with a phased Polaran beam weaponry, and one of them finished the vessel off with a suicide ram, a show of force that put the Federation on notice. Jem'Hadar fighters made regular appearances throughout the Dominion Cold War, occasionally skirmishing with vessels that came through the Bajoran wormhole. A fleet of 150 Jem'Hadar fighters completely wiped out a joint Cardassian-Romulan fleet in the Battle of the Umarian Nebula, and a number of Starfleet vessels were suspected to have been destroyed by Jem'Hadar patrols during this time. When Cardassia officially joined the Dominion, it dispatched thousands of Jem'Hadar fighters to the Alpha Quadrant, where they secured Cardassian space, exterminated the Maquis from the neutral zone, and drove the Klingons away from several conquered Cardassian colonies. As the Dominion entrenched into Cardassian space, they established shipyards that began building more Jem'Hadar fighters, greatly increasing the size of Dominion forces in the Alpha Quadrant. Throughout the Dominion War, Jem'Hadar fighters were the Dominion's main attack craft, appearing in nearly every battle of the war, from the Second Battle of Deep Space Nine to the Battle of Cardassia Prime. The Dominion deployed them by the hundreds in some major battles, and Starfleet actually made use of them on a few occasions as well. Not long prior to the war, Captain Sisko of Deep Space Nine had recovered a crashed Jem'Hadar fighter on Torga 4, which he used to attack a key Dominion supply hub in 2374. The Cardassian Liberation Front stole a second Jem'Hadar fighter in 2375, just towards the end of the war. After the end of the Dominion War and the Dominion's complete withdrawal from the Alpha Quadrant, Jem'Hadar fighters vanished from known space, but they would remain a common sight in the Gamma Quadrant. These deadly craft remained the backbone of Dominion forces for decades following the end of the war, a symbol of the aggression and devotion of the Jem'Hadar. The Jem'Hadar fighter was introduced alongside the Jem'Hadar themselves, who were intended from the start to be an intimidating and reoccurring threat. The Dominion was meant to be a frightening enemy, and since the Jem'Hadar and its ships would be the face of the Dominion, they had to look the part. For the Jem'Hadar fighter, Deep Space Nine's writing department wanted something alien and new, without looking out of place in the Star Trek universe. At the behest of production designer Herman Zimmerman, concept artist Jim Martin went through a variety of designs while working on the Jem'Hadar fighter. Some were organic looking and claw-like, while others were aggressive, spiky, and dominated by straight lines and acute angles. Eventually, Jim Martin settled on a bug-like aesthetic for the Dominion, incorporating some Egyptian influences suggested by Rick Sternbach. Once the concept art was approved, it fell to VFX supervisor Gary Hutzel and Brazil Fabrications to transform it into a studio model. Hutzel and Brazil Fabrications tweaked the design a little over the course of this process, making formerly flat and sharp sections more rounded and bulbous. They also leaned heavily into the beetle-like elements of the ship's design, adding the glowing stripes along the craft's underside to evoke a striped abdomen. The completed studio model was also painted purple at the request of the art department, although this was toned down a little on screen. The final model produced for the Jem'Hadar fighter was deemed appropriately badass by the showrunners. In fact, the ship was considered so imposing that the USS Defiant was written into the show to provide the Federation a counterbalance to it. For its first appearance at the end of Deep Space Nine's second season, and throughout Season 3, the Jem'Hadar fighter was represented by a number of studio models, including some that were designed to be destructible for use in battle sequences. These physical models were replaced by a CGI model during the production of Season 4. This model was created by Carl Hooper of Vision Art Design and Animation, and it was later rebuilt and upgraded during the production of Season 6 by Foundation Imaging's Michael Stetson. The CGI model went on to represent the Jem'Hadar fighter in the vast majority of more than 30 Deep Space Nine episodes in which it appeared. So that's a look at the Jem'Hadar fighter, arguably one of the coolest attack fighters in the Star Trek universe. As always, if you want to keep up to date on the latest Star Trek news, lore, and more, then make sure to hit that subscribe button to never miss a video from the team here at Trek Central. You can also follow us on social media, join our community Discord server, or consider supporting the channel directly through Patreon or via the links below. For now, I've been Captain Jack, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Live long and prosper, my friends. Goodbye.